Okay, so this is the Bible study for May 12th, 2021. We're studying Fulfilled series in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 15 through 40. And the text is starting in verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in the synagogues at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I found no basis for charges against this man, but it is your custom that we release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. So that's our text for today. Remember that you can follow along with us in these questions in this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And question number 1 says, what is happening as we enter into this text? See the previous scriptures. So what we're trying to do is kind of set up what's going on here and what's happening at the beginning of this. So A, Jesus has been betrayed. B, Peter has cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest, but Jesus healed it. See, Jesus has been arrested in the garden. So when we start this text in verse 15, we find Peter and another disciple following Jesus. And so it's helpful to know where they're following Jesus to, where they're following him from, and make sure that we understand what's happened. So all of these things, A, B, and C, have happened. Judas betrayed Jesus. Peter began to fight back and cut off an ear, and Jesus healed it. And ultimately, Jesus was arrested in the garden. And so they're following Jesus, but they're not following Jesus the way they have been following Jesus. They're following Jesus um, under arrest, with the Jewish leaders taking him where they are going to question him. So number 2 says, what are Peter and another disciple doing according to verse 15? So verse 15 says, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. So they were following him. So they were staying close. Now notice there were 11 disciples, plus Judas. And we only find Peter and another disciple. Now, there's a couple things. First of all, it's natural to consider that the people that were closest to Jesus in almost every occasion when you read through the Gospels, the people that stayed the closest were always Peter, James, and John. Occasionally Andrew, but mostly Peter, James, and John. So we have, when Jesus goes a little further to pray, he brings certain disciples with him a little further. And so, although John does not say who the other disciple is, there's some clues. First of all, the ones that always stay close to Jesus are Peter, James, and John. So if Peter's one of them, it may be completely reasonable for us to consider that the other disciple is either James or John. Now, another clue is that John is the only disciple who is very conspicuously never mentioned. So I'm not going to say that there aren't others who weren't mentioned, because there's some, like Bartholomew, for instance, that just seem to never be mentioned when we're talking about. It's really rare to see the names of some of the 12 mentioned. There are others that are mentioned quite often, like Peter, James, and John, perhaps Andrew, perhaps Philip. These are ones that are mentioned quite often. But there's one who is mentioned very often in the other Gospels, who seems never to be mentioned in the Gospel of John, and that is John himself. He really almost never uses his own name. In fact, if you go through the Gospel of John and you just review back through it, we find reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved, which most believe was John himself, how he was referring to himself. And there's a lot of assumptions that we make about why he did this. Some would suggest that, well, he kept referring to himself this way because he was kind of arrogant and thought he was kind of special. A lot of people believe that he really didn't want to insert himself, especially as he became he became the oldest of all the disciples. He became the one that lived the longest, and I think was the last surviving. Is sometimes called John the Elder because of that. And in that perhaps maturity that came with age, he chose not to make himself the focus of the story. In fact, really to remove himself from the story altogether, in terms of being by name. And so I think a lot of people would suggest that this disciple, another disciple, that we're talking about here was John himself. Now it's possible that it was somebody else, and a lot of people, those vague details, those things that are not explicitly declared. There's been all sorts of discussions about, what that means and who that was, but um, I think a lot of people historically believe that that was John. So, number 3, according to verses 15 through 17, what happened when they arrived? A, the other disciple went into the high priest's courtyard with Jesus because he was known by the high priest. Now, I think the way that the disciple comes back out to talk to the servant girl might suggest that the fact that they knew who he was gave him special access. Perhaps the fact that they knew who he was meant that they let him in along with Jesus because he was going to be guilty along with Jesus. Perhaps it just meant that he seemed to belong there. Perhaps I don't know, but it seems like he went in because he seemed to belong there, and he seemed to have sort of been granted special access, whereas Peter didn't have that access and instead waited at the door. Now that's B, the other disciple came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty and brought Peter in. So I'm sure Peter had followed this far that he wanted to be in there and he wanted to know what was going on. But at the same time, he had been the one in the garden who cut off the servant's ear, and was probably the one that, if he was recognized, was most likely to be arrested with Jesus. And he wanted to be in there, but at the same time, he didn't really want to be recognized. So D, the servant girl, asked Peter if he was also one of this man's disciples. Now, the way the question is asked over and over, it seems to be somewhat accusatory. It seems to be, you're not one of the disciples too. Aren't you one of the disciples? I thought I saw you there. And so we see this kind of over and over. That it doesn't seem like it's a positive thing to be one of Jesus' disciples if Jesus was here and arrested. And so, number 4, what did Peter say when he was asked whether he was one of Jesus' disciples? In verse 17, the second part of verse 17, it says, he replied, I am not. Now, this is important because Jesus told him this is what he was going to do. And the John does not focus so much in this story about Peter's sort of remorse after this happens, but John makes sure and tells us that Peter did deny Jesus, deny even knowing him, and not only that did he do that, we're going to say this, he did it multiple times. He did it 3 times. So number 5 says, what did Jesus say when he was questioned about his teaching in verses 20 through 24? He says, A, I have spoken openly to the world. B, I have said nothing in secret. C, ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. I wasn't running around in dark places saying things privately. I said everything I said out in the open, and people heard me. You can ask them. You don't have to have my own testimony. D, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? So this official considered what Jesus was saying and doing offensive because he wasn't answering straight out the high priest. He was pointing out that he had been going about teaching in public, and there was really nothing that he felt ashamed of and was trying to hide, which, by the way, was probably very different from a lot of people who spoke against the religious leaders and spoke, proclaiming themselves to be something. So Jesus said, I haven't been running around hiding. I've said everything I said in public, and if that's what I'm being arrested for, just go and ask everybody that I talked to. They'll tell you what I said. And he wasn't lying, but the official took offense at the way he was speaking to the high priest and slapped him. And he said, if everything I'm saying is true, why are you slapping me? I'm just answering the questions. I'm answering the questions and saying and trying to sort of be logical in all this, that I haven't been hiding, and so there's really no reason to question me. Ultimately, I think Jesus knew that they already had their minds made up about him because they did know what he had been saying. The only question was what he had been saying wrong? And they thought it was. But if it was true, then what he had been saying was right out there, and there would have been nothing wrong with it, obviously. Number 6, what did Peter say when he was asked about being a disciple of Jesus in verse 25? Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." That's the answer. So this is the second denial. What did Peter say when someone asked him if he had been with Jesus in the garden in verses 26 and 27? And this may be the most important, because maybe this was what Peter was most worried about, his actions in the garden. So in verse 26, it says, one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. In that moment, the rooster began to crow. Number 7, this is the reflection. How do you respond when people ask you about your relationship with Jesus? We haven't been cutting off ears, and nobody's crucifying anybody today, so perhaps it's not even a comparison. It should be much easier for us to proclaim our relationship with Jesus to the people we know. But I would say it is probably pretty common for us to minimize our relationship with Jesus, and use words like, "Well, I go to church, but I'm not crazy like them," or to say things like, "Yes, but I'm kind of moderate. Yes, I go to church, but I don't believe in that." And to sort of moderate our relationship with Jesus to the people that are asking about it, because we don't want to be considered extreme. We don't want to be made fun of, or considered an outcast, or considered unpopular by identifying with views that may not be popular culturally, but may be biblical. So then the second part of this question is another deeper step. And it says, is there anything that ties you to Jesus that would even cause people to ask? So unfortunately, see, in Peter's case, people knew that he was a Galilean. People recognized him, thought he might have been in the garden. And we can see that people thought, well, maybe he is this man's disciple. Maybe he is a disciple of Jesus. But I would wonder, for most Christians or people who call themselves Christians, it seems to me like there's nothing different about us that would cause anybody to even ask. And so people may be surprised to find out that we're Christians, rather than being asking, "Aren't you a Christian?" Or "Don't you go to that church?" Or whatever they might not even ask, because there's nothing about us that would make them even recognize or notice that we're a disciple of Jesus Christ. So we need to probably ask that question first, because it's hard to even consider the first part of this question if we've never really been asked, because there's nothing about us that's really different or might signal people to know that we're a disciple of Jesus Christ. Number 8 says, why didn't the Jewish leaders take Jesus into the palace of the Roman governor, according to verse 28? And it tells us that because it was early in the morning by that point, that if they had entered the house of a Gentile, and perhaps specifically the Roman governor, but I think it's more significant that this is not a Jew, it would have made them unclean and they would not be able to participate in the Passover. Isn't it somewhat ironic? I think we look at it kind of with a funny turned head, because it seems strange that people who are trying to kill Jesus, that's their primary motivation. They want this man dead because of all the things that he's saying and doing and how it makes them look and all these other things. And yet they're concerned about making sure that they follow the laws of the Passover. So these are rule followers. These are law-abiding citizens, if you will. These are the sort of people that always do the right thing according to the law, yet they're doing what we now consider, of course, in retrospect, to be the absolute wrong thing, not the will of God. And so that's an interesting thought. So the second part of this says, why didn't the Jews want to judge Jesus by their own law, according to verses 31 and 32? Because that's what Pilate told them to do in the beginning of 31. And they said, we have no right to execute anyone. So they had an objective in mind. They wanted him dead. Now, this has been a somewhat controversial passage, and not really controversial, but I think misunderstood. And some pastors point this out. And then maybe we're confused in the kind of intricacies of the statement. But so Jewish law does allow for execution. However, the Jews were under Roman law. And so it's not that the Jews could not have executed him. And by the way, that blasphemy wasn't, something for him to be stoned for. But the problem was that Roman law and Roman rule did not allow for the Jews to execute someone. So the Jewish law, according to their interpretation of it, would find this person guilty according to their law, but the punishment should be execution, and they don't have authority to execute under Roman law. So they've taken Jesus to this Roman official for the Roman official to execute Jesus, even though he has not broken any Roman law. So that's where the confusion is. That's where the difficulty is here. Jesus, at least in their estimation of it all, has done something that is worthy of death. But the Jews cannot kill him. So they have to hand him over to the Roman official, but Jesus has done nothing deserving death according to Roman law. And so Pilate tries to release him and says, hey, I don't find that he's done anything wrong. In fact, the Jews were trying to say, well, he says he's a king. Isn't that a problem? Isn't that against your law that he would be king and there's no king but Caesar? So then the Jews are trying to find something to accuse Jesus of within the Roman law to allow for the Roman official to execute Jesus. But when Pilate begins to question Jesus, he says, my kingdom's not of this world. They don't understand it. I'm not a king like you're thinking of king, okay? But I am a king, but not the way you think of it, not the way they think of it. So this is not really, um, I mean, I'm no threat to the Roman government. If I was, if my kingdom were of this world, my people would already come and not let me be arrested. But here I am. And so obviously, I'm not that sort of king. And so we have this strange situation where Pilate doesn't find him guilty, but the Jews find him guilty, but the Jews can't kill him and Romans can. And so we're at somewhat of an impasse. And we're at the sort of impasse that would lead Pilate to try to release him, but then ultimately, um, when the Jews aren't having any of it, he does what he does in order to keep the Jews happy and keep them from um, up rising up and causing problems for him that he might be held accountable for. Um, so what's interesting though is how um, important the law is to the Jews, and how they find Jesus guilty by their law and then try to use the Roman law to execute um, their judgment, their outcome. Um, and and isn't it interesting that here they are doing an unrighteous, ungodly thing in the name of the law? So the last part of this question says, is it possible that we can turn against Jesus even while attempting to follow the law? So one of the most significant things, by the way, that I believe Jesus was largely coming to try to overcome in our relationship with God, is the fact that we can follow the law and be nowhere near God. We can make our acts of worship the way it was prescribed in the law, but still be our hearts be far from him. And that was a complaint that God made against Israel over and over in the Old Testament. And one of the things that Jesus was coming to cure, if you will, or to fix, was our tendency to follow the law but not be close to God. And then, nonetheless, they still use the law to crucify Jesus, to get rid of Jesus. Um, and they felt righteous in doing so because they were following the law, but they were really nowhere near the will and the heart of God. And so the question is, can that still happen today? And does that still happen with us? Is it possible that we do things thinking that we're following God, thinking we're standing up for righteousness and for God's honor or for His will, when really we've turned against God entirely and we really don't even know what the will of God is. So here we are following the rules, following the law, following our tradition, but again are far from God. And if that's true of us, then we need to pray again this prayer: search me, O God, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and and try to reconcile ourselves with the will of God, the heart of God, rather than just the law of God.